The second half of Chapter 2 it's still theoretical perspectives and research, but this is the research half of the chapter. You might remember back in high school learning about the scientific method. The scientific method is how we pose questions that we are looking for answers to, and how we collect the data and observe, and all those different steps. The first step is to identify a question. What is it I want to find out? Then we want to come up with an explanation. You come up with a theory, you develop a hypothesis, then you carry out the research, and after you select your research method, collect your data, and analyze your data. And we'll talk about those different research methods. You start with a hypothesis, and that's a prediction, something that you can make a prediction of, but then also be able to test. In the book, they give the example of bonding, and they say, parents and children have to bond immediately after birth. If they don't, there will be a problem, and they look at children who are adopted to see about the bonding between the parent and the child. They've given it that as it's stated, and they state it in a way that's a hypothesis. Operationalization is when we take that hypothesis, that testable idea that we have, and we put it into a testable procedure, and it needs to be something that's measurable and that we can observe. An important term that we will talk a lot about in this half of the chapter is correlational research. Correlational research will look at whether these two things have an association or a relationship to each other. Do they relate? And if you look, relate is the root word in correlation. So we're looking for relationships. So there's an expression in research that says correlation does not prove causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean that one causes the other. Experimental research does look for causal relationships. Does this cause this between different factors? And they take a specific something and to see if it has an influence on something else. Correlational coefficient looks at how strong the relationship is between two factors, and that there's a score of +1 to -1. So a positive coefficient, positive correlation, says that when something goes up, the other thing goes up. For example, the more you study, the better your grades will be. So your studying increases and your grades increase. That's a positive correlation. A negative correlation might be the more you send text messages. I think this is the example in the book. The more text messages you send and the more online communication you have, the lower your grades will be, because assumption being that's probably less time studying. But if one variable goes up and the other goes down, that's an inverse correlation. That's a negative correlation. No correlation, or zero correlation, would be two things that have nothing to do with each other. For example, going to the beach and getting the flu have nothing to do with each other. So sometimes people think two things may have a relationship when they actually don't, and that would be no correlation. So how related or how strongly related two things are would be the correlation coefficient. Naturalistic observation is observing someone or something or a group of people in their natural setting. That would be different from an experimental or observation. Laboratory observation would be where there's strict controlled settings, but under a naturalistic observation, you're watching someone in their natural settings. There's benefits and drawbacks to it, and we'll talk about those in class. Ethnography, if you take a look at the root word ethno, the book tells you it comes from anthropology, and it's about how we investigate cultural questions. And so ethno is related to culture. These are some psychophysiological methods that are used in research: EEGs, CAT scans, and MRIs. You can read more about those. In an experiment, you're looking to find consequences from different treatments, and we'll talk about some examples of that in class. You'll have a dependent and an independent variable. The independent variable is what the researcher is manipulating. That's what they have control over. So, for example, if you were testing a drug, whether they're using an actual drug or a placebo or a sugar pill, the placebo or sugar pill is the independent variable. The dependent variable is whether or not the drug actually works. Is there looking at the results. So if you remind me, I think I have a handout I'll give you in class all about dependent and independent variables, and we can talk more about those in class. Random assignment is important when we're doing an experiment so that you don't have a biased group of people. For example, if you were testing a drug that would benefit a certain population, you want to make sure you're having a sampling of that population, but also of people who are not of that population. If you were looking at something that may affect men more than women or women more than men or people of a certain age group, it's really important that there's random assignment and that you're not picking your participants based on specific criteria. This chart is in your book, and it's a list of research methods that are used for different purposes. Naturalistic, we talked about. Archival, where you're looking back at documents and records. Ethnography, studying different cultures. Survey research, you've probably participated in a survey at some point. It covers a larger population where there's a series of questions on thoughts or attitudes. Case studies are on a smaller group, either individual or small group, where you kind of a longer term study. And then psychophysiological research looks at the relationship, as this says, between the physiological process and behavior. And then they give examples on the other side. Important terminology when we're talking about research is the sample, and those are your participants in a study. A field study is just saying that it's being carried out in the natural setting versus a laboratory study, which just means that there's a controlled environment for the people involved. Theoretical research versus applied research. Theoretical research is usually when you're just looking to learn more about a particular topic. Applied research is usually used when you're looking to solve a particular problem. Take a look in your book on page 42. There's examples of each. I would definitely be aware of those. 3 other kinds of research are longitudinal research, cross-sectional research, and sequential research. Longitudinal research is following one or a group of participants over a long period of time. It has benefits and drawbacks, which we can talk about in class, but so you could follow people for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but it's following that same group of people from start to finish. That is longitudinal research. Cross-sectional research looks at people at different ages and they compare them at the same point in time. So it would be looking at a group of people, say you were trying to find out the differences between people at age 5, 10, and 15, whereas in a longitudinal study, you would look at the same people and follow them at 5 years old, 6 years old, all the way up to 10 years old, and then 15 years old. It's going to take a long time, whereas with cross-sectional research, you could take a group of 5-year-olds, a group of 10-year-olds, and a group of 15-year-olds, and you'd get your results much more quickly. But if you wanted, you could think about what the benefits and drawbacks might be to that. Sequential research combines the best of both worlds of the longitudinal and the cross-sectional. So basically, it's over a shorter period of time, but with people at different ages. So you might have some 5-year-olds, some 10-year-olds, and some 15-year-olds, but you might follow each of those groups over a longer period of time, but shorter period of time than longitudinal, but it's still a period of time as opposed to cross-sequential. Ethics in research are really important. It's really important that researchers protect participants from harm. Thou shalt do no harm is really important, and know that we don't use deception in research. And if you look back in history, there's been a lot of research studies that broke these rules and that hurt people for the sake of research. We can talk about some of those ethical issues in class next week. These are some looking back questions. Why might we want to have different perspectives? How might they overlap? Looking at the scientific method, challenges for researchers, and how culture can be a factor in research.